Welcome to 73 Mentors. I'm your co-host, Jason Vidaurri.
I'm your other co-host, Vincent and Jason Vidaurri.
And here we are at 73 Mentors, helping you finish your unfinished education. We are spending time exploring the 73 most influential people who have ever lived so that we can bring them to life, so that we can learn from them and actually make them our mentors in some ways and share that knowledge and tools that we can derive from them and bring that to you. So today we're discussing Marx, Karl Marx. This is our fourth discussion on Karl Marx, and we're going to be hitting the time periods from about 1850 to 1864. And in this, we're going to get to talk about his loss of children during this time period and the reasons why that happened. We're going to get into the proletariat dictatorship. What is that? And how does that work within Marxism? We're also going to be talking about Marx's influence and his character. And this one in particular, in his years as he's in London, as we've discussed before. He's now been exiled outside of Europe, and he's over in London. So, Vince, why don't you go ahead and... Oh, I guess one other thing on this is we're going to do something a little different here. We're going to try taking sides during this discussion and see how this goes. We'll have a little fun with this. So I'm going to be more on the pro-capitalist side, and Vince is going to take the Marxism side, and we'll throw it back and forth and see how this goes.
Yeah.
So... Kami, why don't you just get us started off here?
Well, we'll start. So this past week, we saw the 116th Congress get ushered in. And if anyone keeps up with politics, you know, it's primarily Democratic. And one of the Democratic newbies, if you will, that has garnered quite a bit of attention. Her name is Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She's out of New York. I believe the 14th Congressional District in New York. And this is a quote that she has. I think it's really apropos for what we've been discussing. It says, quote, "And so I do not think that right now we have this no holds barred Wild West hyper-capitalism. What that means is profit at any cost. Capitalism has not always existed in the world, and it will not always exist in the world. When this country started, we were not a capitalist nation. We did not operate on a capitalist economy." And I think what she's pointing at too is exactly right, is that the United States has always been capitalist. It's only since the middle 1800s that we became capitalist. And so it brings into some doubt, and she brings the doubt, is that maybe this isn't the best system. Maybe there's a better system that would allow for more, what would be, as Marx would say, more equality throughout a society, rather than these big discrepancies that we currently have in both monetary and opportunities that we have within the U.S. This is, again, within the U.S. Marx is obviously, we're going to be talking about more European politics and economics, but what Alexandria is talking about is what's happening in the U.S. So I find it fascinating that she can continue to use some of the same arguments that were used over 150 years ago. If you listen to our previous podcast, you could probably pick up hints of Hegelian philosophy within that. Now, Hegel influenced Marx, and so that's where Marx got his idea of progressing from one economic system to another. So you can pick that up in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's idea that capitalism has not always existed in the world, and it will not always exist in the world. The idea that we're under this constant pressure of two opposing forces and the emergence of a third force from that. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, so when you put that quote there as something we're going to talk about, I'll admit some of it was triggering to me, and I'll go through it and talk through why. So the first part, she starts off with, this is no holds bar Wild West hypercapitalism. That is that what it means is profit at any cost. You know, I look at that and I'm like, it's a common tactic, I guess I would say, and I guess Marx used the same tactic as well. It's a triggering tactic to elicit emotion. there's nothing about capitalism as we say here in early 2019 is less capitalistic than it had been in the past. There's more socialist things that go on now than it has been in the past. So there's nothing about, I find a lack of validity in here, Wild West hyper capitalism statement. And profit at any cost is also not true. You know, I work in the oil industry with one of the big companies. They're not specifically on the oil side, more on the chemical side. But nevertheless, I'll tell you right now, even in my experience as a chemical engineer in the past 20 years, the amount of stuff we do in terms of safety and in terms of environmental work is tremendous. It's a huge cost for the company. So it's not always about just making profit. We have huge concerns about, hey, I'll give you an example, just to kind of lay this out and show you how companies have changed over time. You could, I guess, maybe comparing this back to, you know, someone working in the coal mine back in the 1940s, like our grandpa, perhaps, Vince. There was no, I'm sure there's no safety talks that day. You know, make sure you work safely. Don't breathe in too much coal today. None of that kind of stuff was going on. But this happened in our morning meeting, which we had every day at work. Some worker out on the plant with his hard hat on had bumped his head. And maybe I talked about this story before. He bumped his head with his hard hat. Didn't get hurt, just hit his head on a bar that was built with the scaffolding that we had built for them to access higher levels. And I'm not kidding. We sat, there's probably about 30 of us in that meeting. From the senior leadership in our plant to some of the more the workers, supervisors and everything. We sat and talked about that for about 10, 15 minutes on what we could do to make that better. And it was a simple bar, but we got to go out there and take a look, walk around, and make sure this is going to be fine. We move that bar up higher so that someone doesn't hit their head again. And like I said, there's no injury. He had a hard hat on. It was no problem, but it was, we're at that level of safety. It's like, well, wait, there could have been something more worse that happened. So let's do everything we can. Let's be diligent up front to make it safe for our workers. Now you can say, is that profit at any cost? That's very much the opposite. The amount of money that we've probably spent having that discussion just with all those people in that room is in thousands of dollars of time, even in that, plus the further work we did after that moment. So I guess that part of that statement I didn't like. I mean, I think she's right about certain things on that, though. She's saying, hey, capitalism hasn't always existed in the world. Okay, yeah, that's true. Will it always exist? I don't know. Probably not. I mean, if you look at it historically, systems come and go. Economic systems have come and gone. So she's probably right on that. But what it is, now that's or what it should be or what it could be, that's a whole nother discussion. So that was my first thoughts on the opening discussion.
Well, I think she's pointing more towards, I understand what you're saying, is that companies now are probably more responsible than they were 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago as far as concern for the worker. At least as safety is concerned. I think what she's pointing out is not so much the day-to-day operation on that level as she's pointing out the discrepancy between the worker and what they make versus what the CEO makes. Like we mentioned last week about Jeff Bezos. So Bezos is making or is worth whatever, trillions of dollars. And when you have people in the plants that he's working in making minimum wage, $10 to $15 an hour. So I think that's what she's kind of pointing out, this hyper capitalistic, for profit or profit at any cost type of system, is that the discrepancy between those who are making the most money and those who are making the least amount of money, that gap continues to get wider and wider over time, or is as wide as it ever has been now versus even 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll probably get more to this as we get into this, but you come to this questions like, okay, how do we decide that then? How do we decide what's the gap is too big? Who decides that?
Government.
But maybe move it to Marx a little bit more before we keep going off on this side.
let's wait until we get more into his ideas. We'll start here though. We'll start. So we left off. He went from Paris. He went into Cologne. I'm sorry. He went to Brussels. Then he went to Cologne. He went back to Cologne. And Cologne, remember, Cologne was in Germany, the western part of Germany. he was involved as the chief editor of a paper at that one time, a very radical paper, and they basically, Germany exiled him. And that's why he went to Paris. Then Paris exiled him, he went to Brussels, and now he went back to Cologne very briefly in 1848 because he wanted to start the same paper with a new twist, and it looked like it was gaining some traction and that there was going to be a revolution and that the workers, basically Marxism was going to overtake the monarchy and the feudal system that existed. But unfortunately, that didn't work out for him. The revolution failed miserably, and at that point, neither Brussels nor Paris wanted him, and obviously Germany didn't want him. So he was left with the only place he could go was London. So he was exiled in London, and so this was in 1849. He moved to London. When he initially moved there, it was thought that this was going to be a short stay, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, but not very long. He thought he'd probably move back to either to Paris or hopefully back to Germany, and that never transpired. What ended up happening, he moved there, like I said, in 1849, and he basically lived there for the rest of his life, and he died there in 1883. The period that we're focusing on, Jason mentioned, is from 1850 to 1864-ish. And during this period, especially that decade between 1850 and 1860, just imagine this, is that he's German, his English wasn't that great, and he's moving he's been to London before. He actually started the Communist League several years before and was the head of the Communist League, which still existed when he moved there. But exiles in London weren't, I mean, it wasn't as if the English people harassed them or anything. It was just, they were a non-entity almost. And so Marx lived there almost in obscurity for about a decade. His living was of nothing else than severe poverty. And during that period, he relied on Frederick Engels to provide some substance, monetary support. He did have some other revolutionary friends who would try to provide him with some support. For the most part, though, he never was able to garner any routine amount of income outside of one spot, and that was he started writing in the New York Daily Tribune, and at that time the New York Daily Tribune had a readership of about 200,000 people, which was great. I mean, it's a large subscription at the time, and he would get I believe somewhere around £1 for every article he wrote, and he would be able to write one about once a week. So, but for the most part, he was in desperate straits and dire poverty throughout this decade. Shortly after he got there too, he disbanded the Communist League that he had started several years before. In 1850, it disbanded, mostly because Marx reached a point where he wanted what we consider Marxism to be as pure as possible. And there was too much deviation from true Marxism, so he thought it best to just disband it entirely in order to preserve any notion of his ideas. So that was disbanded in 1850. That's where he was, again, in London for a year, living in obscurity, mostly as an observer. So if you read the Das Kapital, Communist Manifesto, and a couple other writings, is that you have to understand he was using the Londoners and the English as a laboratory in a certain sense in order to gain his ideas. So it does have kind of a potentially English bent to it, his writings. What are your thoughts, Jason, on this period?
No, I mean, it's a tough period. We're going to get into some more details on. I guess especially part of it was a touching part of it for me was the family life and what those dire conditions really were in the level of poverty that I was in. When we first kick off on this, we get a little development of his ideas, or maybe more writings on his ideas. And so I wanted to move us into that and this concept of a proletariat dictatorship. What is that? And how does that work? And so this is a quote from Marx. comes from page 193 in the reading of Berlin that we're in. But he said this. He said, "What I did was new was to prove that the existence of classes is bound up only with particular historical phases in the development of production. Number two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And number three, that this dictatorship itself constitutes only the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society." And so part of to clarify and say what that means, basically part of Marx's thought was, because of the previous revolution in 1848 that he went through, he came to this idea that, hey, you can't expect the proletariat themselves, the workers themselves, to have the tools, the ability, the knowledge to be able to rise up and take over society, so to speak. They don't have that. So instead, there's this transition that needs to happen, where you have a proletariat dictatorship. So you take over the state, you take over the government through this proletariat dictatorship that then will then educate the proletariat, bring them along, help them along until finally, when they're ready and they can take it, you transition into this classless society where there's no more classes, no more state anymore, and everybody's at the same equal playing field. That's where you have equality and justice and that harmonious society that Marx is talking about at the end. Did I get it right? Or is there?
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I think that's exactly on spot. Is that 1848 failed revolution? Point out some glaring missteps that Marx subsequently changed, and that was this: is that he, prior to the revolution, he thought that the proletariat as a mass, as a group, would have the wherewithal to continue this revolution, and then once it overthrew the governing body, or in this case the monarchy and the bourgeoisie, that it could then be the leader. And because of the failed revolution, he realized that that can't happen, that the proletariat as a group does not have the wherewithal, does not have the right tools, nor the leadership, nor the acumen to really do that. So because of that, what he moves to is this idea of proletariat dictatorship. And Jason's right, is that you have to have someone in charge. I mean, when you have a revolution, you have to have someone in charge. You can't have the whole labor force being in charge, because it just doesn't function that way. And so it doesn't function well that way. And it's not able to maintain momentum, and it wouldn't be able to ward off either a counter revolution or get control of enough of the government and the security forces, or the military, if you will, or certain aspects of the society that will allow it to function. So the idea is this proletariat dictator would function in that manner. It would give the laborers the direction they needed to go in order for the society to continue to function and continue the revolution, and then have Marxism ushered in.
Okay. So let me push on this a little bit, because this is probably one of the ideas we ran into earlier, but it's one of the ideas that's hit me, and it's like, well, I don't see how this works. I guess one of the foundations of this concept is that you're going to empower a certain group of people or a certain individual to have almost all the same power, all the dictatorial power that he has. And then at some point, you're going to think he's going to relinquish that power and give it to all the people. I think we see, I mean, that's a huge stretch to ask a human being in our human condition to do. And furthermore, I think probably the biggest part of that, I think in practice, especially through the 20th century, whenever this has been tried, that dictatorship never goes away willingly. So I don't know, I guess part of it I see when Marx, he makes this kind of claim, I almost feel like he's missing some of the basic human condition. The human condition that says, or it's like, how am I going to, these people are going to act so noble in this only one time, but yet in a capitalist society, they're acting upon greed and upon exploitation. But then suddenly they're going to act noble in this situation and create this ideal society. I guess that's my first counter on that. It's like, I never see it happening. And in practice, we've never seen it happen.
Yeah, well, I think he would point out that if you're pointing to people like Mao or Lenin or Stalin or Castro or as examples of not relinquishing their power, I think Marx would point out the flaws in those individuals. These individuals didn't have the proletariat in mind that he has in mind. They didn't have in mind the endpoint that he has in mind. They weren't full-on Marxists. If they were full-on Marxists, they would have done a couple things. One, they wouldn't have held onto the power as long as they did. And two, they would have started eliminating the class systems, which they didn't necessarily do. They just created a new class system. So if you're pointing as those as examples of the 20th century where it doesn't work, well, it doesn't work because they weren't following Marxist ideas. They were doing they were, I would say, parading as Marxists, but they weren't really Marxists. Otherwise, they would have relinquished the power at a certain point in time. Or not only that, but they would have carried on the Marxist ideas to start eliminating classes more than they did.
Yeah, I would even put this on Marx himself. I think if Marx himself was in this condition, he wouldn't relinquish power. And I say that because if you look at how he acted through his life and with his associates, even those who were with him on his ideas, say they were with him 90% of the way, he didn't relinquish his authority and power with those people and very much cast them out within his group. And so it's almost like he wants this ideal person. I guess in my mind, that doesn't exist. It doesn't even exist in him if he was in that position. Because you don't see him within these organizations. He always wanted to be the one. And if someone deviated from him, he's like, no, you shouldn't be here.
I think in that regard, I think he was correct, though, is that you look at all the individuals that he was countering, you go to anyone, none of those people have any little to no influence on today's activities. But you and I are here talking about Marx. Maybe he was, and maybe he was such a unique individual, because you have to admit, I mean, the guy spent, during this whole decade, he spent what claims to be 10 hours a day in the British Museum studying nothing but economics and statistics and politics. Maybe his insight, I'm going to claim his insight was so in depth compared to his competitors that he had a right not to relinquish power to these individuals because they were faulty. They didn't know what was really, they didn't know the direction that they were going. They were misdirected. They were trying to take the revolution in a direction that was going to fail. And what Marx was doing was trying to keep it on track in order to overthrow the bourgeoisie of the time. And I think it's true today too.
So how do you ever come to this point when the experiment has failed? For Marxism, I would just say dictatorship. When a dictatorship comes into power with all the good intentions to make society better, has there ever been an example where he's willingly then given up that power to all the people?
Well, I would say
really the hundreds of times this has been tried throughout history in different governments, and my point is it's never happened.
But it's never. I don't think you can point to any one of those. Let's even the bigger ones. So let's say China, Soviet Union, and Cuba. None of those would you ever claim adhered to all the Marxist principles anyway. So has there really been a Marxist or what we would consider a pure capitalistic society? And I would say there has not been.
You mean a pure capitalistic society, or
pure communistic society. Okay. So there's never been a pure Marxist society. So given that, is that if you only go halfway, of course you're going to have some failures. And because these leaders didn't want to adhere to the principles, nor did they take the principles that they did adhere to far enough. And if they had done that, then it would have worked. I think it would have worked.
All right. Well, we'll have to disagree on that. I don't think it's within the human. Let me further. I guess I'll go. I mean, let's just keep moving down this path and see where it goes.
Okay.
Here's another one that, and I guess we're kind of getting some of the appeals of Marxism, because it seems to address so many of the ills that we see in our society. Another one is this concept of inequality.
Mhm.
We talked about a little bit. We talked about Bezos making so much money in our last episode versus his worker, and so there is these inequalities within our society. I guess one part I never seen Marxism in creating this dictatorship and this proletariat dictatorship. What do you do with the inequality that's in people? Now, I'll make the statement that, I mean, here we are in 2019. I think it's pretty obvious that people are different. We have different talents. We have different abilities. Marx would probably say, hey, it's the system around that person that created that inequality. I guess I'd counter that and say that that's not totally true. You have people, I'll say my own children or people have seen children grow up in the same household, but come out very differently. There's differences within people. You can classify that as inequality. You can classify it as diversity within people. What do you do within the Marxism system with that inequality in people?
My point to this is that I don't think Marx would say there's the inequality that he's pointing to, and we'll use Bezos as an example. Is there a 250 million unit difference between one individual and another? Because that's what we're talking about, is that one individual makes $1 while Bezos is making 250 million. That's a gross inequality. Now, are there inequalities between people? Yes, but are they that different? Does Bezos have an IQ that's 250 million times more than? Is he contributing to society 250 million times more than the average worker that is working underneath him? The point is I don't think there is. So there's a degree, the discrepancy or the inequality, the gross inequality that's created by a capitalistic system exacerbates the differences between individuals, where a Marxist system would minimize those. If not almost.
Well, I think it has to go before, more than just minimize them, because if you still minimized, you still have difference. You still have classes potentially. And you say, no, it's a classes state. We're all equal. We're all on the same ground for now and forevermore. We're always equal. And I'm asking you, well, wait a minute here. A person inherently, individual to individual, are not equal. We're not the same. I'm not LeBron James. I'll never be able to play basketball like he does. There's an inequality between us. So what do we do about that? Do I get to play on the NBA just like LeBron James does because we're equal? And you get to go watch the NBA with a bunch of average people because you can't have LeBron being out there. You have to distribute it.
And I think that there's a difference between physical and intellectual differences and economic differences. So Marx is going to focus more on economical difference. Well, fine, you can have the NBA, but the amount of money that they're going to get paid is going to be on the level more of a everyday worker. Because what does LeBron James contribute to society? You mentioned, what does he make? I don't know, $22 million or 20, let's just say $20 million. So $20 million a year. Does he contribute any more to society than the coal worker in West Virginia, to your everyday stuff? The coal worker, I would argue that the coal worker in West Virginia contributes more to everyday society than LeBron James. LeBron James is nothing but entertainment. He's not contributing.
Okay. So you acknowledge this coal worker is contributing more to society than LeBron James. Does he get more pay then? He's giving more to society.
I'm saying that LeBron James, his salary should be more on the same level as that coal. There shouldn't be a.
Wait, on the same level or the same?
The same.
Exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
Okay. So now you have a worker that's contributing more than the next worker, and he's getting the same salary.
Yes.
Keep playing that through society. I got Fred over here who sits on his ass all day, not doing anything. He gets the same salary as Joe, who's working in this factory every day, trying to make it the best he can, and doing some great work, contributing to society, because that's his natural talents, that's his ability, that's his intellect that he wants to do that, where Fred doesn't, and you're going to pay him the same.
Yes.
I think that just ends society. It'll collapse. You'll have maybe this is something beyond Marxism. Then if we get to Marxism as being this idea of progression, then it has to flip and become something else again, because you have an inherent tension within the system. I got unequal people getting pushed to equality forcibly by the state is the only way that happens. Otherwise, my more productive person is, hey, wait a minute, this is not right. This is unfair. This is morally wrong. This is inequality. I'm doing more. I'm contributing more to society, yet I'm not rewarded for that.
But I mean, I think you say that, but I think we already have certain systems that are set up that are Marxist that work just.
Yeah, of course.
So we have public education is, for all intents and purposes, a socialistic and Marxist society. That if you're a teacher, you get paid. If you and I are teachers, you're an amazing teacher. You've done all you can, and I show up. We're getting paid the same, but you don't see it. You don't see the teachers uprising against each other. They still go to work. Actually, I mean, to try to get into the teaching profession in certain parts of the country is almost impossible because of the number of people that want to get there, because everyone's treated equally.
Is that why they really want to be there?
I think so.
It's probably, I would argue it's probably the districts that pay the most money are the ones that get in those teachers that really want to be there.
That they have the most benefits too. I mean, so again, you're not getting more you're not getting more pay. Your health benefits are no different, and your retirement's no different. Whether you teach, you're the best teacher in the United States or you're the worst teacher in the United States.
So why aren't these same teachers fighting to get into inner cities? Why aren't they fighting to be there? You can make them, you may potentially be able to make the most difference there, right? I mean, if you're a teacher, you want to better the education of the kids, why not fight to be there?
Not sure. I guess I would. I mean, I guess if the pay is going to be the same no matter almost anywhere I go, roughly. Why would I go? Well, the cost of living is one. Is some inner cities you couldn't afford the cost of living to be there. And then I guess the job too. The students that you have would be more challenging. So making a gross generalization though is that if I'm getting paid the same as you're getting paid, why would I make my task any more difficult than it has to be?
But my point is, I guess that what you do is I'm saying, why don't they right now? Because the reality is they don't. Teachers are fighting. I mean, I had this experience when I was in Wyoming and right on the border of Utah, that teachers were coming to teach in Wyoming because they paid better. There's very simple incentive. It's like, well, I'm going to get paid. I'm going to essentially do the same work, but I'm going to get paid better. So where am I going to go? I'm going to go where I'm going to get paid better. I mean, that's a natural tendency for all of us. So my point is, and I guess I should concede this point. I'm not saying, I'm not fighting for that everything should be pure capitalistic, laissez-faire capitalism, where it's just pure capitalism all the way. I mean, we have to acknowledge that where we live right now is not that. Like you mentioned, fire departments, police departments, we have social needs that we have social solutions for that seem to work. But my point is that you can't go all the way with Marxism, where it's pure Marxism and you have no more incentives for these different things. That's where I said that's too far. There's maybe it's I get into this. Lots of times we get in these arguments. Is it A or B? Is it A or B? A or B? You know, the truth of it is probably a little bit of A, some of B, and C and D is probably the answer. But we want to simplify things and say A or B, A or B. And so I can see that, hey, that there's some social programs and parts of our society that are good and right, but to tear down capitalism completely and say no, Marxism is the solution, that's where I'm arguing against, saying there's no way, it doesn't work, it hasn't worked. It's a theoretical idea. I think that in practicality, because of the human condition, because of I say fundamentally because of humans and what we are, you don't get there.
And the point, I guess, the other thing is to launch off of that, though, is that you don't. And this goes back to Hegel when we're talking about Hegel and his dialectic. is you don't typically have a nuanced existence, very, very rarely. You typically have these drastic transformations. So we went from a monarchist system, revolutionist in France, to a democratic system. You went from a feudal system to a capitalistic system. So I think what we're looking at too is that historically that's how it's been, is that you have these drastic transitions. What you're suggesting is that, well, it's nuanced, and I'm going to agree that there is some nuance there, but can you truly have a Marxist / capitalistic system coexisting? And I would say historically that's not been the case. What you're going to have is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, is that capitalism has not always existed in the world, and it will not always exist in the world. So it's not as if it historically has not proven out that you can start adopting or morphing slightly into these hybrids. What you're going to have is it's going to be capitalist, and then it's going to be flipped into something else. Now, I'm advocating that it's going to be flipped into a Marxist system or a socialistic system, because that is what we've seen in other countries happen. If a Marxist socialist, so you see it in the Scandinavian countries, you see it in Mexico, you've seen it in Cuba, you've seen it in a lot of South American countries, and you see pretty much all the European countries now have shifted more from a capitalistic system into a more socialistic system. Now,
yeah, but even those countries are far away from Marxism.
They are. They are. I'll concede that. Probably the one that's probably been the closest to Marxist is probably China. China, and to some extent for a while the Soviet Union is probably what would be closest to the Marxist system completely.
I guess my other challenge on Marxism, they say, hey, this is because it's appealing on multiple levels. It really is. I mean, because it says, hey, inequality is bad. This fixes inequality. It says injustice. We don't like injustices. It fixes that. It is the next part of progression. There's multiple things that it says it's good about, but when you can't even conceptually tell me, what do you do with inequality within individuals then? There's no idea of like, what do you do with that? That's a problem. I have a hard time tearing down capitalism, which has been the best system we've had so far. Best system in terms of bringing wealth to the world. Best system in terms of individual freedoms, so people can choose the kind of life that they want to live. Is it perfect? No, of course not. It's not perfect. There's a bunch of problems with it still. But when someone can say, hey, Marxism is the answer, and it can't answer these simple questions about it, even conceptual, let alone in practice, to me, that's a problem. That's a big problem. You don't tear down the best system that's ever been for some lofty idea that you can't even explain yet on how it really works.
From a Hegelian point of view, I think he would concede and acknowledge that capitalism for the time is the best it can be, because society is always progressing. It's always progressing in the next phase, the next era, the next epoch is always better than the previous one. So yeah, I don't think Hegel would deny that. And to a certain degree, I don't even know if Marx would deny that as the time is, currently capitalism is the best system. That doesn't mean going forward that Marxism would not be better. And you're right. I mean, there's some questions that can't be answered, but there are some questions before capitalism came about that couldn't be answered either. How do you, when you have the Industrial Revolution, is how do you get workers, or how do you maintain workers? How do you educate workers? How do you get someone going from a field to go into a factory? How do you get someone who's a farmer becoming a widget maker? Those weren't known, and yet for some reason, we were able to figure that out. And granted, I think there are some holes within Marxism, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that can't be figured out in time. as we go through this.
So I guess what the argument is that all these countries that have tried it just wasn't time yet. We just haven't gotten there yet. It's a temporary setback. Or why did they fail then? What was it that it didn't work out?
Well, I think I think to answer that question, I think we have to take a little bit broader view. Is that if we go back to where Marx is now, so 1850s, 1860s, I think you'd have to agree that we are more socialistic, more Marxist now than we were then. At that time, it was almost, and especially in France, you almost had this laissez-faire capitalistic system.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've adopted at least some aspects of Marxism in almost pretty much every country. And you even can see that, right now we probably are the most prosperous and most fortunate than we ever have been. And I would say that the reason that is not simply capitalism, but it's capitalism with some Marxist ideas in there that stabilized societies, especially the Western societies now. So why did the other ones fail? I think it goes back to, I don't think they adopted fully Marxist ideas. They failed, and to some degree they failed because, and I don't think Marx would disagree, this is that it takes a unique individual to be a proletariat dictator. And that individual, this has not emerged in any one of those systems. You've had flawed individuals, and it's going to take the right individual in order to lead the proletariat. And it just hasn't happened. You mentioned, the timing wasn't right. And I think Marx mentioned that too, is that, 1848, the timing wasn't right. The timing wasn't right during the 50s or 1850s or 60s. That doesn't mean that there won't be a time that will soon come where a leader will emerge, or leaders will emerge that will be able to take that next step and allow Marxism to be ushered in.
Okay. Well, we'll sit on that for a while.
Well, I think the other thing I was going to mention is you're talking about inequalities of individuals, though, but isn't part of the inequality created by individuals because of the system that we're under?
I think in part, you have to acknowledge that it's a society, but like I said, the perfect example is siblings raised under the same roof, having essentially the same education, same parents, same everything. And that comes out sometimes drastically different, where one of those siblings might be highly successful. The other one might be in prison. So now you say, wait, now in that case, you say, well, the system, they grew up in a very similar system, but they came out very different. And their contributions to society might be very different. So what do you do with that under Marxism? You say, well, I got very different contributions, very different. I got a lot of inequality within it. What do I do? Well, I push that. Basically, I almost see this as a huge, here's the other challenge. You basically, how do you force that equality at that level? They're going to have the same income. They're going to have the same everything. It takes a huge governmental system now. Now you have to empower someone to force that equality. It has to be the government. Now the government is all powerful. It's making all the decisions. It's dictating all the things that happen. That sounds like a pretty suppressive system for any of us to live under.
But if it creates equality and it creates justice and it creates, let's just leave with those two. If it creates equality and justice with the mass, isn't it worthwhile relinquishing, or at least abdicating some of those, we'll say, duties? So there's going to be differences between, but maybe it's because the current system, the educational system that we're under, you have drastic differences. Well, if the government got involved and you had more people involved with the bringing up of children than they do now, maybe that wouldn't happen. Maybe you would. Yeah, I think that wouldn't happen as frequently. Not that it would never happen, but I think it would happen less frequently.
Well, I think the other challenge, and maybe this comes from my basic experience and seeing, I guess I'll say on the other side of it. I think one of the beauties of capitalism and how it has functioned as well as it has It's because it's distributed power to individuals as much as it can. I mean, it's not perfectly right, but I as an individual have a lot of choice and a lot of decisions that I can make for myself. If I don't like my current situation, I can go and try to change it. I can get education. I can try to do these different things. Like I said, it's not a perfect system, but I have that opportunity. With the Marxism and having to have such a strong state that forces equality, all that goes away. Jason, will be sitting, I'll be equal with my neighbors, probably equally oppressed by the system itself, but I'll have no choice. There's no say. I can't even make my situation better because who's there to appeal to? The state? And the state that says, no, you are under the system. You are equal to everybody else. But I have some idea. I have an innovation that will help our society. Maybe they would allow me to go for it, but there would be no incentive to go for it. I'm going to get the same pay no matter what I do. I can create this new idea, this new innovation, sacrifice my time and my energy and make it happen to better the society. And then I'm in the exact same situation that I've always been. You kill the incentive. You killed the individual and the motivations and the freedoms within the individual to create an oppressive equality, I guess is the way I say it, because you can't get there any other way.
But I mean, what you're doing is you're saying you want to change your situation. You want to improve your situation.
Yeah, you said, well, let's say the equality is where I don't have a roof over my head and my kids are starving. But we're all in that situation together, and I want it to be better. You say, well, but you guys are all equal. You're all in that same situation. You're fine. And I say, no, I want the situation to be better. Or you can even say, no, I'm barely making ends meet. My family's better alive, but I would like something a little bit better than that. Is that I would like us to be able to go have a vacation. The system says, no, there's not enough in the system for you to have that. You have what you have, and that's what it is. And again, you've taken away the individual, you've taken away the choice, the freedoms, and I mean, to me, all the things that Marxism purports to do, it actually flips on its head and does all the opposite once it's fully in place, because it ignored the basic human differences.
Well, I think you're pointing out extremes. Is that if Marxism was to provide your basic needs. Okay, you have a house. You have the food that you need in order to survive and everyone to survive under your household. You had your work. You had your vacation time. That was all provided. I mean, that was all built into the system itself. And I think if you have the mindset, and from an early age, you have the mindset that this is the system that is best for you, there'd be no need or desire to do anything else, because everyone lives in the same 1,500 square foot home. Everyone works at the factory for 6 hours a day.
How many kids do I get to have?
As many as you want. It's not limited that. I mean, if you're going to have more kids, then
I get more pay though, right? Because I have more kids.
Well, yeah, you're going to get more pay, or the government system is going to subsidize that in some fashion in order to make your accommodations as equal as someone. You have 6 kids versus someone who has 2. Your standard of living would be the same.
But what if I want to change my standard? What if I want to go do something? What if I have an idea? Like I said, I want to create something. What do I do with that?
But why would you want to do? I don't know. This is, I think, where we get sucked into the capitalistic idea, is that we want something more. And that's just a function of the system itself. The system itself has told you, Jason, you want something more. The system itself has told you, Jason, you should go out and innovate. The system itself has told you that things should be better than they currently are. It's built in. You and I wouldn't be as great a consumers if we didn't want more. So the system itself has created consumption, materialism.
Well, I think Marxism will still have that, because you'll see the people who are running the government are going to be the ones with the money and the power and the authority. They'll have those better lives. They'll have the better housing. And they're not going to relinquish that. And everybody else is going to be a state below. The same thing that's happened when we've tried it already. Now you said it hasn't been the purest form. The people weren't pure Marxists enough. But the steps that we did try to take towards it, that's what you got. And the people that lived under the systems, I mean, you can ask anybody who lived under those systems, was that equality and the beauty and the what you thought it would be? It's like, no, it wasn't. It was oppressive. We were starving. And in most cases, many people died to get that system even started, let alone what it did after once it got going.
Again, I think I would go back to this, a lack of ability of the leaders, not the system itself. They weren't able to carry out the true Marxist system. That if they were able to carry it out, then that wouldn't happen, or those type of things wouldn't happen. Well, let's go on.
I know we've been.
So let's go to. You want to talk about? Let's go to his International Workmen's Association.
Okay, let's move on to that.
Okay, so again, we're dealing with 1850s. He went to London in 1849. From 1850 to 1864, as I mentioned before, Marx was pretty much lived in obscurity. I mean, and especially after 1960, he was almost seen as a relic or a past generation of a revolution, more of a historical figure than someone who's a current activist. Until 1864, and in 1864, what emerged, and this was ironic, it was that Marx wasn't even spearheading this. This was basically the labor unions in France, if I recall correctly, in England, Italy, and maybe Germany. They got together at a conference and they formed what is considered the International Workmen's Association. And so this was in 1864, and I'll read the at least some excerpts from the inaugural address, which Marx gave, and they elected him the leader of this association. And this is quote, and this is, this is the inaugural address of the International Workmen's Association. Quote, considering the emancipation of the working classes must be won by the working classes themselves, that the economical subjugation of the man of labor to the monopolizer of the means of labor lies at the bottom of servitude in all its forms, of all its social misery, mental degradation, and political dependency. That the economical emancipation of the working class is therefore the great end to which every political movement ought to subordinate as a means. That all efforts aiming at the great end have hitherto failed from the want of solidarity between the manifold divisions of labor in every country, and from the absence of a fraternal bond of union between the working classes of different countries. So what Marx is pointing out, which is the basis of Marxism, is that in order for this, one, the enemy of the working class, the enemy of the laborer is the capitalist, is the industrialist. And the focus should be an international gathering of all laborers for one purpose only, and that's to overthrow the industrialist. So it's called, basically, it's economical emancipation. Go ahead, Jason.
I not much to say on that other than one of the pieces in the work said that inauguration address was almost on the level of the Communist Manifesto in terms of his writing and in terms of his clarity on socialism. And so I thought that was interesting on that. That's about all I had to say on that area of his life, other than, I guess one part of it was that you mentioned that during that decade, 1850, 1860, he's kind of obscurity, but this really brought Marx out again during this time period. And he really, I think some of the letters written to Engel during that time were of his jovial, and really he's kind of fired up again. Yeah. Although it didn't increase his income any, so he was still poor, but he was apparently more engaged and more excited about the work again.
I think I see that more as a rebirth. He went through a little over a decade of this obscurity, observation, and intense study. And then in 1864, he got elected to lead this association, which gave him a rebirth. I guess the other part of this is, so it only lasted a short while because the working conditions in each country wasn't the same. So it was really hard to get everyone, as he mentioned in here, he wants everyone to have a manifold division. He wants everyone to have a fraternal bond of a union between working classes of different countries. So he wants a bond between all these countries, between all the working classes, so that they can overthrow the current economical system, get economical emancipation. But in a very short time after this, it was realized, and he even acknowledged that it wasn't reasonable because the working conditions in the English Isles versus France versus Germany versus Italy and like the Czech Republic were all different. So, but he still led it. So they were still looking. This is the fascinating thing, is that they were still looking to him for direction. And there was a lot of veneration, I would say, in his direction regarding how the movements, even outside of Germany and England, how they should emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Well, I want to touch a little bit on his family, because I thought this was a main part of this era of his life. And like we mentioned already, he was in pretty desperate poverty during this period and got help from Engels, and a few others gave him help along the way. And he did have a little bit of income coming from his writing, but not much. And probably the most tragic part of this, as I read it, was during this time he lost two of his sons, Guido and Edgar, and his daughter Francisca, all died during this time, primarily as a result of the conditions in which they lived in, primarily a result of their poverty. And even to the point he didn't have even money to have a coffin for his daughter. And I wanted to read this one quote because I thought it was a little telling, at least in part of what. Well, Vince, why don't you read yours first, and I'll
read mine. He's talking about after the death of his son Edgar, who he was very fond of. It. Edgar was eight at the time that he died, and again, as Jason mentioned, it was just due to their extreme poverty. And he writes to Engels, quote, "I have suffered every kind of misfortune, but I have only just learnt what real unhappiness is. In the midst of all the suffering which I have gone through in these days, the thought of you and your friendship and the hope that we may still have something reasonable to do in this world has kept me upright." So that's what he's writing to Engels about after the death of his 8-year-old son, Edgar. Go ahead, Jason.
He further writes to LaSalle, which we'll probably talk about here, one of the other associates he had at the time he wrote this. Said, Bacon says that really important people have so many contacts with nature and the world, have so much to interest them, that they easily get over any loss. I'm not one of those important people. My child's death has affected me so greatly that I feel the loss as bitterly as on the first day. My wife is also completely broken down. In reading this, I couldn't help but feel for Marx and the loss of 3 children during this time period, and the difficulty of that, and I guess a bit of an admiration too, that the work was so important to him that it seemed that he was going to go through it no matter what the cost. But I guess on the flip side, I was also questioning, like, well, man, could you have done something in, I don't know a situation, I don't know what things were like, but could you have done something different to provide for your family a little bit more, so that maybe you wouldn't have lost your children because of this extreme poverty that you were in? So, I mean, it's hard. Like I said, it's kind of a mixture of admiration that the work needed to go on for him, and at least in his mind, that he needed to keep doing what he was doing to bring the work about, but also like, and I don't know how I could have been in that situation, or if I wouldn't have been, forget it. I'm just going to go get some income, get some food on the table for the kids, and this work's going to be set aside. I guess that would be my response probably.
Yeah. It's this part I had a difficult time with, is that, I mean, losing a child would be hard enough, but to lose 3, and actually at a certain point he lost 4 children, 4 of his 7 children. mostly due to poor conditions. He lost 3 right in a row, or really in a short period of time. And the other one, I believe, died shortly after birth. So, yeah, I think this is a difficult part. And and as we go through his writings during this time, I think we're going to pick up some of his resentment and his, maybe to lack of a better, his anger at a system that doesn't allow a man to be able to provide for his children. I think that's how he would present it, is that, could this happen in the United States today? I think it could, but you would have to almost go out of your way for it to happen. I mean, there's so many, what we would consider social programs that exist in order to help those individuals. If nothing else, his kids could have went, I mean, if this is up in modern day, his kids could have went to school and eaten. I mean, that's just almost a given. Almost in any community, the school would feed them breakfast and lunch, and maybe even an after school program where they'd feed them dinner. So the likelihood that someone would die of starvation in the United States is, again, you'd have to really go out of your way to do that. Where I didn't get that sense, I got the sense that he was one of many, one of a multitude of people that lived on the edge of subsistence and death. So I guess his criticism was, this is what I'm fighting for. I mean, I don't want people to end up in a situation similar to I without any governmental system to help them. The other thing that's fascinating is that at this time, the English were going through just a rapid growth, economic growth that they had never experienced before. And to see, and he goes back to what we were talking about before, to see that amount of, let's say, wealth and economic growth, and at the same time you have masses living on the fringes. Again, it points to an inequality that could have been at least partially, if not completely, rectified.
Anything else you want to say on that, or we should go on to?
No, I think that's good. And
yeah,
like I said, I think when we get to his writings, I think it'll come out a little bit clearer that, I mean, there's some admiration. I have admiration too, is that someone could see their life work as so important to, in a sense, sacrifice their children for. I mean, that's dedication on a level that I don't think a lot of people are willing to give.
You know, that brings up this concept, Vincent, in the 73 mentors looking at, so far who we've looked at, the level of sacrifice of these individuals is enormous. I mean, really, so far, you know, Plato to Galileo to now Marx. We'll see if this keeps playing out, but man, these are life works for these people to be so influential. Life works that require sacrifice of a lot. I mean, you know, lifetime, not just time and energy and effort, but, you know, here in Marx's case, his children to some degree. So I don't know. That's a lot of sacrifice. Well,
if we look at this, let's just say the last two, Galileo and Marx, is that in a sense, Marx is in exile for the last 30 some years of his life. Galileo was in exile for the last 7 or 8 years of his life. Yeah. So, I mean, when we start dealing, I think, with these type of individuals, it's, I think, as people say, oh, aspire to be, I want to change the world. You know, the idea, I want to change the world. I think as we go through this and we read about this is, do you really want to change the world? I mean, you can say that, but are you willing to put in the sacrifice and the time? And I think we should mention this too. Not only that, but the likelihood that anyone will recognize you in your lifetime for your works.
Yeah,
it doesn't typically happen. In this case, I mean, Marx got a little bit. I mean, he got out of poverty in this later part of his life, but it wasn't as if he was this international superstar. So, again, do you want to change the world? Oh, you do. You really want to change? What are you willing to sacrifice? How about your children? How about living in exile for 30 years? How about living in poverty for 10 years? How about being imprisoned? Are you willing to do that to change the world?
And then leave this life never knowing if you made a difference.
Exactly. So Sounds like a pretty high bar to reach. And then in some cases, it doesn't even work out.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of people in here. We mentioned just briefly, we can talk about him, Ferdinand Lassalle, who was in all essence a Marxist, but he was more charismatic, and he led a German led labor union, if you will. He was very influential, and probably more so than Marx was in Germany at the time. And what happened to him? He dies in a duel, and
that's right,
and falls into obscurity. I mean, if you ask anyone, I bet you, the likelihood anyone knows who Ferdinand Lassalle is virtually zero. It's like, okay, this guy dedicated his life to this, and he dies in a duel because of a love affair, but he dedicated his life to a revolution, and no one knows who he is. So again, I think it's a high bar, and then the likelihood it works out is pretty minimal.
We're kind of getting into Marx's character here.
Yep.
And I actually have a quote that deals with Lassalle, and we just brought him up. Is he says that, this is from the reading we had. It says this, talking about Lassalle. It says his relations with Marx and Engels had never been wholly easy. He declared that Marx was in theoretical matters his master, and treated him with nervous respect. He heralded him everywhere as a man of genius, arranged for the German publications of his books, and otherwise strove to be in the service of him in many ways. Marx grudgingly recognized the value of Lassalle's energy and his organizing ability, but was repelled by him personally and was deeply suspicious of him politically. So you get a couple different pictures there. You get a picture of Lassalle and his capabilities, but you also get a picture of Marx and some of his character and his thoughts toward. This was one of my points earlier. Is like, even for someone like Lassalle, who's basically in the trenches along with him, maybe had a few different views, but that's to be expected with different individuals. And Marx still has some grudging feelings about him because of those differences. And I think Marx, that's not the only example. You see, it seems to be with Marx, especially in this time period, and maybe it's because of the life situation he's going through. It seems like everybody except for Engels just didn't rub him right, and those relationships didn't really last.
I think there was a couple of quotes in there, more or less saying like he was quick to rebuff anyone who brought up ideas that were contrary to his. I think Marx, to me, embodies most men, I think, in that he liked flattery. So if you were to flatter him, I think he enjoyed it. But more than flatter, he liked submission. In that you saw any organization, association that got involved in, he wanted to rise to the top and he wanted to take control of it. And anyone who tried to subvert his authority, I think he quickly rebuffed them and tried to set them back into his place. And part of that, I think, is his intellect. And I think he dedicated, and this is one thing I think he had a problem with Lassalle, is that you think about Marx, is he dedicated decades of his life to understanding the economical and political pressures that historically evolve in man, where Lassalle, he was what I could tell was more of a talker. He picked up on talking points and was able to rally people around those without the deep introspection that Marx had, and the deep understanding and wherewithal that Marx had. He didn't have that. And I think that's where I think he was taken away from some of Marx's influence, but he was doing it in such a way that didn't garner any of Marx's respect, because he didn't do it out of understanding on labor. He didn't get it from that. He got it from Marx's teaching, and he just took bits and pieces of it and then packaged it in such a way that he could gather some influence. And he did. I mean, Lassalle, from all accounts, seemed like a very a very attractive individual to be around. And even I think at one point, one of the monarchs said that he had never met a man that he would with such talents as Lassalle. So I mean, I think he was a very charismatic individual.
That makes me think of Vince when we kind of setting out on this 73 mentors and looking at the most influential people. You may think that, well, probably the most influential people are probably these charismatic characters, these people that can really rally and gather people around them, and then therefore they have influence. And Marx is a clear demonstration of not being that kind of person,
Yeah.
really being the opposite. And one of the questions that came through my mind in this reading was, wow, if Marx did have some of those more charismatic characteristics, would have his work gone further? Would it have been more influential? I don't know if I know the answer to that, but it's an interesting thought. It's like, if you merged Lassalle's abilities with Marx's knowledge and background, what kind of character would that have been?
Yeah. No, it seems like it would seem like he would have been more influential. But again, that may have taken away from his deep understanding of what was going on. If he had dedicated more time to go to rallies and getting all these people and more presentation and public speaking, maybe his insights wouldn't have been as acute as they ended up being. And part of this is interesting that we haven't mentioned yet, Jason, is that all his writings, or I'll say a significant number of his writings, especially to the New York Daily Tribune, were to some degree helped by Engels.
Yeah.
Just because Marx some of them he didn't know. His English wasn't that great to be anyway. And then you're talking about some very unique, I remember there was an article in there talking about how to write about the German Civil War.
Yeah, military strategy stuff.
Yeah, and so he didn't know that, where Engels seemed like a really versatile person and an excellent writer. So I don't think we can discount Engels' influence on Marxism existing as it does today.
No.
Having the influence it does today, because some of Marx's actual writing that's contributed mostly to him, it's not easily accessible, and I think I'll just put it out there. I think my perspective is Engels smoothed that over a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's what I got.
Accessible. So
yeah. Now I think we brought that up early in our contents, like how these key people in Marx's life really accelerated, if not helped create that work and that influence that he eventually had. And I think we asked that question earlier. Is like, well, how do you those associations, those interactions through life seem to be such happenstance. They just seem to happen or not happen. And the question was, can you cultivate a way to have those intersections happen in your life more? Where you're meeting that person that really makes a difference in your life, that teacher, or I don't know if there's an answer to that, but it seems like if you could do that, if you could craft that in your life, it would be hugely advantageous.
I think we mentioned this before too, is that I think the only way, as you mentioned, can you craft that? I think the only way you can craft that is you have to intentionally seek it out.
Yeah.
And say, okay, I mean, let's just, in this regard, is that, the reason Marx met Engels is because they were both radical. Okay, yeah. Well, if you want to be a radical, you have to be around other radical people. Yeah. Lassalle, the only reason he got to where he was around Engels' writings, and eventually he was around Marx himself. Lassalle was around Marx, so then he picked it up. So I guess if you want to say, can you craft that? I think you can to a certain degree, because you're around people that you want to aspire to be, or at least they have some either character or quality that you're looking to either refine or gather on for yourself.
I agree with that. That's good. That's a good point. I think also putting yourself out there, right? Just being around them is not part of it, but you put yourself in your, a level of your, maybe it's a common word today, is the level of vulnerability of yourself. Marx was putting himself out there, no doubt. This is my beliefs, this is what I am, and I'm firm on them, and here it is.
Yeah.
Even being a radical and going through what he went through.
Yeah.
And therefore that intersection with Engels was able to occur. So
I agree.
Said about that.
You want a closing statement? I'll have a closing statement. You want to do it that way?
Yeah, I guess so. That sounds pretty good. We've been chatting here, went back and forth a little bit, and gave some of our characteristics and history on Marx and through the years 1850 to about 1864. So,
okay. Well, I'll give him my closing is this: is that so Lassalle Ferdinand Lassalle was also Jewish. So as we mentioned the first one, Marx is Jewish. And I don't think that's coincidental that you have two individuals. So just to give you, Lassalle is pretty much the founder of what would today be considered the social democrats of the European countries. So it's a huge influence. People may not know his name, but he did form that aspect of thought and political thought. But when I was looking at this, I was thinking Jews at the time were not accepted in European society. They're outcasts. They're pariahs. And Lassalle was a trained lawyer, but he had no outlet to be a trained. He couldn't fully practice as a trained lawyer. I think Marx had a PhD. He wasn't hired because he was a radical and he didn't fit into the normal thought of German life at the time. But my thought is, at some point, if you've ostracized a certain sector of individuals, i.e. the Jews, from participating in everyday life, they have to have some outlet. Neither one of these individuals, I could tell Marx, we know a little bit more than Lassalle. I think it never mentions that Lassalle was particularly religious. And Marx, it says, I mean, obviously he was, as you read it, as we get into his thoughts, wasn't religious and maybe even anti-religious. So what are they going to fight against? I think to some degree, what they fought against was a system that ostracized them, that made them pariahs. And maybe that's the reason for them trying to overthrow the entire system, to have a classless society. Because if there's a classless society, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or non-Jew. You're part of the group. And who doesn't want to be part of the group? Who doesn't want to be associated with? So I think in a deep psychological way, both of these men were seeking to just be included. And that may have driven them to try to overthrow the entire system itself in order to be, you think a classless society, you talk about inclusion, you're included. And Jason was mentioning, well, we're all poor. Well, you're all included to be poor, but you're all poor. So your inclusion is there. So I think I can't discount it, at least when I'm reflecting on this, that I can't discount that didn't play a part, that they were both Jewish and that they were trying to find a way to just be included into a system or a society that was moving so quickly and in a sense was keeping them out from being part of that. So that's my thoughts, Jason.
I'll just close with this. Just the thought of, it's been eye-opening for me to study Marx at this depth, and it really did challenge myself on my thoughts and my thinking, and really, I guess the nice part about it has been to look at capitalism differently than I had looked at it. You know, growing up in capitalistic society, I've always been pretty in favor of it, but to step out and I guess, look through Marx's eyes and say, well, here's some of the challenges with it. That's been good. That's been good to see that, and to also look at the counter of those ideas and to counter back and say, well, yeah, here's what we also know, from Marx's time in his writing, 150 years later, here's some more data to put into the equation, to analyze that, to look at it, to see where we're at. And I'm looking forward to continuing here with Marx, and we're almost going to move into the Communist Manifesto here and dive into another one of his works, and not just his life and some of the other things going on around him. So I guess the closing thought is this, is that, in diving into something like this, it's there's just more there. There's more moving parts than you might think. We brought this up before, Vince, but we have this tendency as humans to want to be able to simplify things. And I mentioned earlier, I want to know, is it A or B? Tell me if it's A or B so I can organize my life and know how I should live. Well, I think at least I have often found as I've gotten older, is that most of the time it's not A or B. Most of the time it's A, maybe it's A and B with a little bit of C and D in there. It's like, oh, I never had thought of it that way. And that's the added complexity and stuff that that we get to explore in this life. And so, and there's two sides of that. On one side, I'm excited to keep learning. On the other side, it makes it more challenging to orient and to figure out what you ought to do. So, but I'm looking forward to it. That's where I'll close today.